They hung her with a sign that said, "Don't mess with the white man," until a lonely wanderer rescue her. The town of Harmony Creek was a whisper of a name in a land that screamed desolation. Dust-choked and sun-scorched, it exuded a pervasive air of suspicion, fear, and a chilling, pious certainty of its own righteousness. Wyatt Hart, a man carved from cynicism and scarred by a war he refused to name, kept to the ridges a ghost avoiding the living. He had no business with God-fearing folk. His only creed was the worn leather of his gun belt and the heavy silence of his past. Then he saw her, a figure dangling from a lone cottonwood, swaying in the heat haze. Her dark hair danced in the wind, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn sign tied around her neck. The words were a brand of raw hate, "Don't mess with the white man." The air hitched in Wyatt's lungs. It wasn't just a lynching. It was an echo of the very massacre that had sent him into exile. The ghost he outran every dawn was now hanging right before him. He wasn't a man who worked miracles, but as Nayeli White Cloud's life faded before his eyes, he knew he had to answer. The rope groaned like a dying animal as Wyatt's knife sawed through its coarse fibers. He worked with a grim mechanical precision, the muscle memory of 100 desperate moments taking over. The world had narrowed to this single, terrible task under the vast, indifferent sky. Her body, limp and unnervingly light, fell into his arms. A dead weight. For a heartbeat, he thought he was too late. The splintered wood of the sign scraped against his knuckles, its hateful words a final silent curse. He laid her on the parched earth, a crumpled form of buckskin and bruised flesh. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the cottonwood, a sound like a sad, forgotten song. His own breath was a harsh rasp in his throat. He had not meant to stop. He had not meant to look. But he had. And the ghosts of his past, the ones he drank to forget and rode to outrun, had risen from the dust to meet him. He knelt, his fingers calloused and unsteady, searching for a pulse at her throat. The skin was cool. Too cool. He felt nothing. Then a flicker. A fragile, thready beat as faint as a moth's wing against his thumb. Thump. Thump. A life refusing to be extinguished. A canteen was at her lips before he was conscious of drawing it. "Water!" He rasped the word, tasting like rust. "Drink it." Her eyelids fluttered. They were dark, deep-set pools of pain, struggling to focus on the cracked blue sky above. A single dry sob escaped her throat as the water trickled past her lips. She coughed a weak, rattling sound. Her gaze shifted, finding his face for the first time. There was no gratitude in it, no fear, only a profound, ancient weariness. "The sky," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing, the sound of crushed leaves. "It burns. Just the sun going down." Wyatt said, his tone clipped, dismissive of anything beyond the raw facts of survival. He pulled the hateful sign from her neck, the rope, leaving an angry red welt, a noose of memory. He tossed the plank aside as if it were a venomous snake. He was a practical man. He dealt in bodies and bounties, not omens. But as he looked at her, at the quiet dignity that clung to her even in this state of ultimate degradation, the hard ground of his certainty began to shift beneath him. This was not just a body. It was an echo of a screaming village of blue-coated soldiers moving through smoke, of a promise he had failed to keep. Not again. The thought was not his own. It was the voice of a younger man, a boy who had stood by and done nothing. His focus snapped back to the present. On the low ridge overlooking the town, figures had appeared. Small silhouettes against the bleeding sunset. They were watching. The townsfolk of Harmony Creek had seen his defiance. He had cut down their effigy of hate, and in doing so had declared himself an enemy. There was no going back. The purse of coin he carried for his last job felt like a pocketful of hot lead. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She didn't answer, only tried to push herself up a gasp of pain, her only reply. Her strength was gone. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, she weighed almost nothing, and swung her onto the saddle of his weary horse. He mounted behind her, her head lolling back against his chest, her breath a warm, faint ghost against his neck. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her tight, the other hand gripping the reins. "Hi-ya!" he growled, kicking the horse into a desperate gallop away from the hanging tree, away from the watchful eyes of the town. They rode into the deepening shadows, two fugitives bound by a single, violent act of mercy. The land opened up before them, a canvas of stark beauty and hidden dangers. As the moon rose, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the landscape, he allowed the horse to slow. Nayeli stirred against him, a soft murmur escaping her lips. In the silver light, he saw it. A small, intricate tattoo of a soaring hawk on the back of her hand. His blood ran cold. He had seen that mark before. Years ago. On the hand of a woman reaching for her child just before the world had dissolved into fire and screams. The echo was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. He wasn't just saving a stranger. He was confronting a debt 20 years past, due in the heart of a godless land. The Badlands swallowed them whole. They rode through a maze of stone and shadow, the moon a cold silver witness in the star-dusted sky. Every canyon whispered a threat, every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of a gathering posse. Wyatt pushed his horse mercilessly, the animal's breath pluming in the chill air, its sides heaving. He could feel Nayeli's fragile weight against his back, a constant searing reminder. The hawk tattoo. It was burned into his mind's eye. He wasn't just a man on the run. He was a ghost fleeing a graveyard of his own making, and now one of the dead had come back to life in his arms. The irony was a bitter metallic taste in his mouth, sharper than the dust. Hours before dawn, the horse stumbled, its strength finally spent. They were in a shallow, forgotten arroyo, its walls carved by ancient waters. It offered meager cover, but it would have to do. "We stop here," he grunted, sliding from the saddle. His own legs nearly buckled from exhaustion. He gently lowered Nayeli to the ground, propping her against the cold stone wall of the wash. She was conscious now, her dark eyes open and alert, tracking his every move. He built a small smokeless fire in a hollow of the rock using dry brush he'd gathered. It was a risk, but the cold was a more immediate enemy. The flames licked to life, casting dancing shadows that made the canyon walls seem to writhe. He turned to her, his movements stiff. The raw, ugly welt on her neck stood out in the firelight, a violent necklace of rope and hate. He took a clean rag from his saddlebag and wet it from his canteen. "This'll sting," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He knelt before her. As he reached to clean the wound, his hand trembled. He willed it still, but the tremor was a rebellion from deep within his soul. Her eyes met his, and he saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not pity, but a quiet, unnerving understanding. "The rope. It leaves a memory in the skin," she whispered, her voice stronger now, a low melodic thing despite its rasp. "It's the men who tied it that leave the scars." Wyatt countered, his voice rougher than he intended as he dabbed at the raw flesh. He was a man of facts, of steel and leather. He did not speak of memories in the skin. She was silent for a long moment, watching the firelight play across his grim face. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the flames and the vast, empty hush of the desert night. "They are the same men," she said, her voice so soft he almost thought the wind had carried it away. "The ones who burned the winter lodges. Their hate is an old fire." Wyatt froze. His hand hovered over her neck. The rag felt like a block of ice. She remembers. The thought was a physical blow. He pulled his hand back, his carefully constructed wall of detachment crumbling into dust. He couldn't look at her. He busied himself with the fire, poking at it with the stick, his knuckles white. "You should rest." He mumbled, his gaze fixed on the flames. Rest is a luxury for those who are not hunted. She replied, her logic as sharp and clean as a shard of flint. They will come. For both of us. I can handle myself, he bit out. Can you? Her question was not a challenge. It was a genuine inquiry laden with a wisdom that felt centuries old. He finally risked a glance at her. She was watching him, her head tilted slightly, her gaze piercing the shadows he wrapped around himself. You carry their ghosts too, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a shared diagnosis. I see them in your eyes. They are loud. The air left his lungs. He felt exposed, seen in a way he hadn't been in 20 years. This woman, broken and brutalized, was looking past his hardened exterior, past the cynical shell, and seeing the terrified boy still screaming inside him. He had ridden into this to save her a final desperate act of atonement. But as he looked into her knowing eyes, a terrifying new thought took root. Maybe in the end she was the one who had come to save him. Wyatt felt her words like a physical blow. You carry their ghosts too. I see them in your eyes. He recoiled, turning his back to her, and stared out into the oppressive darkness of the arroyo. The fire crackled, spitting embers that died in the sand, each one a fleeting, fiery ghost. He was a man who lived by a simple, brutal code: don't look back. Don't feel. Don't remember. This woman, with her quiet voice and ancient eyes, was breaking every rule he had. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and abrasive in the stillness. The horse needs water, and I need to see how far they'll track in the dark. It was an excuse, a retreat into the familiar territory of practical action. He grabbed his rifle, the cold weight of the steel a comforting anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. He moved away from the fire, melting into the shadows, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. For an hour he was a creature of the wilderness again. He scouted the edges of their temporary sanctuary, reading the story of the land in the moonlight. He found a seep of alkali-laced water for the horse, just enough to keep it going. He listened. He listened for the telltale sound of shod horses on stone, for the distant call of men. There was nothing, only the immense breathing silence of the night. For now they were safe, a fragile temporary peace. When he returned, the fire was burning low, and Nayeli was no longer huddled against the wall. She was on her feet, moving with a stiff, painful grace. She had found a broad, flat leaf and was grinding something into it with a smooth river stone. The air was filled with a sharp, clean, herbal scent. "You are hurt," she said, not looking at him. It wasn't a question. Wyatt glanced down at his forearm, where a long, shallow gash from a ricocheted rock during their flight was weeping a thin line of blood. He hadn't even registered it. "It's nothing. Nothing is a welcome door for infection to walk through," she countered, her voice holding a new note of authority. The authority of a healer in her element. She turned, and in her hand she held the poultice of crushed leaves. "Sit." He wanted to refuse. He wanted to retreat behind his wall of gruff self-sufficiency. But her gaze was steady, unwavering, and he found himself obeying without argument. He sat on a rock by the fire, feeling strangely like a recalcitrant child. She knelt before him, the firelight catching the high planes of her face, turning the bruise on her cheek into a deep violet shadow. Her touch was impossibly gentle as she cleaned the wound, her fingers deft and sure. He flinched, not from the sting, but from the simple, profound act of care. No one had touched him with such tenderness in years. He felt a deep, shameful unease. He who had been a part of the blue-coated tide that had washed away her world was now receiving her grace. It was a weight heavier than any stone. "My grandmother taught me the way of the green-growing things," she murmured, as if sensing his turmoil and offering a path away from it. She applied the cool, fragrant paste to his arm. She said that every plant has a story, a purpose, some to heal the flesh, some to quiet a troubled mind, and some are for remembering. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Some things are best forgot. Forgetting does not make them go away, she whispered, wrapping the wound with a strip of cloth she'd torn from her own buckskin dress. It only makes them grow stronger in the dark, like a poison root. Her work was done, but she did not move away. Her fingers rested lightly on his forearm. Her gaze dropped, and she saw it. A different mark, older, a puckered silver slash just below his elbow, a scar that was not from this land, but from another lifetime. He tried to pull his arm away, but her grip, though gentle, was firm. She traced its edge with the tip of her finger. The touch was like a brand of fire. This one, she said, her voice dropping, becoming a thread of sound, a fragile bridge across 2 decades of pain. This scar tells a different story. He stared at her, his heart stopping in his chest. His throat was a knot of sand and ashes. She finally looked up, her dark eyes locking with his, and in their depths he saw not just memory but recognition, a terrible, absolute certainty. "I've seen this mark before," she said, her voice clear and steady in the firelit silence, leaving no room for escape. "On a young soldier, a boy with haunted eyes who tried to shield a child, just before the fire came." The silence that followed her words was a living thing, a vast, hollow space where 20 years of unspoken history screamed. Wyatt snatched his arm back as if her touch had been a hot iron, the scar on his skin suddenly burning with the memory of its creation. He couldn't breathe. The canyon walls seemed to press in the firelight, a merciless interrogator. He was trapped, not by rock and sand, but by the gaze of a woman who had seen his soul on the worst day of his life. He tried to form a denial to summon the gruff, dismissive man he had pretended to be for 2 decades. But the words were ash in his mouth. The ghost was out, and it would not be forced back into the shadows. He rose, stumbling away from the fire, away from her. He braced his hands against the cold stone of the arroyo wall. His head hung low, the rifle on the ground, forgotten. His shoulders shook with a silent, racking tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He began, his voice a raw, broken thing he didn't recognize. "I was a boy, following orders." The words tasted like lies, like poison. An excuse so thin and worn it offered no cover at all. He had told himself that lie 1,000 times in the bottom of 1,000 bottles, and it had never once been true. He heard her move the soft scrape of buckskin on sand. He didn't look, couldn't bear to see the accusation in her eyes. But when she spoke, her voice held no condemnation. It held only a profound, weary sorrow. "A boy, yes," she said, her voice just behind him now. "I saw many boys that day. Some had the faces of monsters. Some had the faces of frightened children. Yours was the face of a ghost even then. You were already haunted by what you had not yet done." He squeezed his eyes shut, the images flooding back, vivid and brutal. The smoke, the screams, the smell of blood and burning canvas. "That day," she continued, her voice a low, steady current that anchored him in the swirling chaos of his memory. "The spirits of my people cried out. The sky wept smoke. I saw a river of blue coats, a river of hate. But I also saw one small stone try to stand against the flood." He turned slowly, his face a ruin of anguish. "A stone that failed." "A stone that remembers," she corrected softly. "I saw you. I was hidden. I saw the officer, the one with the face of a hawk, give the order to fire on the women's lodge. And I saw you, the boy with the haunted eyes, lower your rifle by a hand's breadth. It was not enough. But it was not nothing." She paused, letting the truth of that long-buried moment settle between them. "And when he struck you for your defiance, leaving that mark on your arm, I saw that too. I remembered the face of the one soldier who showed a flicker of a human soul. He finally looked at her truly, looked at her and saw not a victim, but the keeper of a memory he had tried to murder within himself. She was the sole witness to the one tiny pathetic act of decency he had managed in a day of unforgivable sin. The knowledge broke him. A ragged sob was torn from his chest, a sound of pure, undiluted grief that had been locked away for 20 years. He slid down the rock wall, his strength gone, and buried his face in his hands. The tears came then hot and shameful, carving clean paths through the grime on his face. He wept for the people she had lost. He wept for the boy he had been. He wept for the man he had failed to become. He did not feel her hand on his shoulder at first. It was a light, hesitant touch, a question. He didn't flinch. He leaned into it, a drowning man clinging to the barest hope of shore. They stayed that way for a long time, two survivors huddled together in the dark, their shared silence a language more profound than words. They were no longer a white man and an Indian woman, a rescuer in his charge. They were the last two people on earth who knew the truth of Willow Creek, a kinship of ghosts. As the first pale hint of dawn touched the lip of the canyon, the spell broke. The immediate, brutal reality of their situation returned. The posse would be stirring their trackers, cutting for sign. Wyatt pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his soul scoured clean. The shame was still there, a permanent part of him now, but the crushing weight of his secret was gone, shared between them. He looked at Nayeli. Her face was calm, her strength a quiet, unshakable mountain. The fire of her hate, which she had every right to feel, had been banked and forged into something else. Resilience, resolve. They'll be looking for tracks leading south, he said, his voice hoarse, but clear, the mind of the soldier taking over. Away from the town. Nayeli shook her head, her gaze sweeping over the rock formations, reading the land in a way he never could. No, the land to the south is open, a trap. The hawk builds its nest in high hidden places. We go north, into the broken country. It is a harder path, but it is a wiser one. He looked at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes. She knew this world, its secrets, and its rhythms better than any map. He had been leading them, driven by his guilt. But that was over. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, an offering of trust, a surrender of command. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Lead the way." They moved north at dawn. The land changed. The soft rolling plains gave way to a harsh, broken country of jagged rock and thorny scrub, a place that tore at clothes and skin with casual malice. It was a landscape designed to break a man's spirit, but it did not break Nayeli's. Wyatt watched, a silent observer, as she led them through the treacherous maze. He had thought himself a master of survival, a man who could read the land like a book. He was wrong. He knew how to read the signs of men, a broken twig, a scuffed stone. Nayeli read the land's soul. She moved with a purpose that came from a place deeper than knowledge. It came from kinship. She found water in the shadow of a sun-scorched boulder, cupping her hands to drink from a trickle he would have missed entirely. She pointed out the pale green leaves of a bush he'd have called a weed. "The root is good," she said simply. "It gives strength." They ate the bitter, starchy root raw, and he felt a warmth spread through his exhausted limbs. He was the soldier, the man with the gun. But here in this unforgiving wilderness, he was the student. His respect for her, born in the fire of her survival, now deepened into a quiet awe. "How do you know this path?" he asked once, as she led them along a barely perceptible game trail that snaked between towering hoodoos of red rock. "The hawk does not fly in a straight line," she answered, her gaze sweeping the sky. "It follows the whispers of the wind, the currents of the earth. This is the hawk's path. It is older than any trail made by men." That evening they found shelter in a shallow overhang, a stony lip on the side of a small butte that looked out over a vast, empty valley. The view was magnificent, beautiful, and terrible in its emptiness. From here they could see for miles. From here they could be seen. They shared the last of the bitter route as the sun set, painting the distant mesas in strokes of gold and fire. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken ghosts. It was a comfortable shared quiet, the silence of two people who had seen the worst of each other's worlds and were still sitting here together. Wyatt looked at his rifle lying beside him on the rock. The blued steel seemed cold, alien in this place. "This is all I know," he said, the admission costing him more than he would ever let on. How to break things, how to end them. Nayeli followed his gaze. She was holding a small, tough wildflower with a vibrant purple bloom she had plucked from a crack in the rock. "And I know how to mend," she said softly, her fingers gently tracing the delicate petals. "Perhaps the world needs both, the breaker of stone and the flower that grows in the cracks." He had no answer for that. He only knew that for the first time in 20 years he felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of something that was not shame. It might have been peace. The feeling was shattered by a glint of light. It was miles away on the crest of a far-off ridge, but it was unmistakable. The flash of a spyglass catching the last rays of the sun. Once, then twice. A signal. Wyatt was on his feet in an instant, his body coiled with the soldier's instinct. The peace was a mirage. The hunt was still on. He scanned the valley below, his eyes narrowed, searching for the posse. He saw nothing. No dust, no riders. "They're too far," he muttered more to himself than to her. "They can't have seen us. Not here." But Nayeli was not looking at the glint on the ridge. She was looking at the valley spread before them, at the shape of the land, her expression hardening into a mask of dawning horror. "They did not need to see us," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. She stood pointing a trembling finger not at the signal, but at the contours of the land itself. "This arroyo. It runs for miles, but it narrows, up ahead." She traced a line in the air with her finger. "It ends in a box canyon. Steep walls. No way out." A cold dread trickled down Wyatt's spine, colder than any winter wind. He understood. Silas Kane, the man who knew this land from his own brutal campaigns, was not a common tracker. He was a tactician. He was a wolf. "He's not just following us." Wyatt breathed the words, a puff of smoke in the cooling air. "No." Nayeli's eyes met his, and he saw in them the reflection of their shared, terrible fate. "He is not following. He is herding. This is not a chase. It is a trap. And we have been walking into it since dawn." The box canyon was a cathedral of stone, silent and severe. Sunlight streamed into the natural prison, illuminating walls of sheer red rock that soared towards a sliver of impossible blue sky. There was no escape. It was a beautiful grave, the place Silas Kane had chosen for them to die. But they would not die here. Not like this. "The wall," Nayeli said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. She pointed to a high ledge where a collection of loose, fractured boulders clung precariously to the cliff face. "It is weak, unsettled, like a man with a bad heart." Wyatt's soldier's eye saw it instantly. A choke point, a deadfall, a chance. "It's high," he said, gauging the distance. "A shot from here would be a gamble." "Then you must not gamble," she replied, her gaze meeting his. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, burning resolve. "You must be certain." They didn't speak again. There was nothing left to say. They took their positions, melting into the rocks on the opposite side of the canyon, 100 feet above the sandy floor. Wyatt lay prone, the stock of his rifle cool and solid against his cheek. He slowed his breathing, the world narrowing to the rifle's sight and the single keystone Nayeli had shown him. Nayeli was beside him, a silent shadow, her hand resting on his shoulder, not for comfort, but as a quiet transference of strength. a shared vow. They heard the horses before they saw them. The arrogant clatter of hooves echoed off the canyon walls. Silas Kane and his 5 remaining men rode into the canyon as if on parade. They saw the single exhausted horse tied at the canyon's end and laughed. Nowhere left to run, Hart. Kane's voice boomed a sound of smug, final victory. A traitor to your blood, hiding in a hole with a savage, I'm going to enjoy this. Wyatt did not answer. He was a statue of perfect stillness. He watched Kane dismount a predator, savoring the moment before the kill. This land does not belong to you, Silas Kane. Nayeli's voice called out clear and ringing not a plea, but a judgment. It has witnessed your hate, and today it will claim its debt. Kane laughed a harsh, ugly sound. The land takes what it's given. He raised his pistol. And I'm about to make it a gift of your corpses. That was the moment. Wyatt's rifle cracked. The sound was sharp, definitive. It was not aimed at a man. It was aimed at the keystone 100 yards away, 100 feet up. The bullet struck with a puff of red dust. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then a low groan echoed through the stone. A single boulder shifted, dislodging another. A cascade began a trickle of pebbles, turning into a river of rock, a thundering, grinding roar as the entire ledge gave way. An avalanche of stone and fury unleashed by a single, certain shot. Kane and his men looked up, their faces, masks of shocked disbelief. The world dissolved into a hell of dust and shattering rock. The posse was scattered, 2 men and their horses crushed instantly. The others were thrown broken and half-buried, their cries of agony swallowed by the deafening roar. When the dust began to settle, a choking red cloud that filled the canyon, only 1 man stood near the center, stunned but unharmed. Silas Kane. He was cut off from the entrance, trapped with them. He roared in pure rage and charged toward their position, firing his pistol wildly. But Wyatt was already moving, sliding down a shale slope to meet him on the canyon floor. This was not for the posse to see. This was personal. This was for the boy with the haunted eyes and the ghosts he carried. They met in the center of the dusty arena, a brutal, desperate clash. It was not a gunfight. It was a reckoning. Kane was bigger, stronger, fueled by a lifetime of hate. Wyatt was faster, driven by 20 years of shame. They fought with fists and knives and raw, desperate will. In the end, Wyatt stood over Kane's still form, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. His body was a map of new bruises, but his soul felt quiet. The screaming had stopped. He looked up. Nayeli was making her way down to him, her face calm, her eyes holding the deep, silent peace of a storm that has passed. They did not speak. They simply stood together in the silent, dusty cathedral, the graves of their hunters at their feet. They were alive. They were free. But as the sun began its descent, casting long, somber shadows across the canyon, they knew they could not go back. The world outside this canyon was still the same. The hate that drove Silas Kane had not died with him. They had won the battle, but the war for a place in that world was one they could never win. They took what supplies they could, and without a backward glance led their horse out of the canyon's mouth. They rode north, not towards any town or settlement, but into the vast, unknown heart of the broken country. 2 survivors, their pasts acknowledged, their futures a blank page. They were no longer running from ghosts. They were simply riding toward the dawn, a wilderness of 2. Their silence, a promise, their shared path, the only home they had left.